using config split to split your config across your different environments and even different websites. That last part's a little bit crazier, and it sort of works. I'm Josh Fabian. I'm technical director at Code Koalas. So I'm over all the developers, and I tell people what to do. On my website, I did post the link to the Git repo for the sample site I spun up for this, and then the blog section, which will be like the slides and all the technical write-up stuff will come soon, but I spent too much time trying to get the and sites part working that I didn't have time to write that. Cool. So who has used config split? Some people. Awesome. So if you didn't know, it is a way to take your config sync, which is in Drupal 8, but to specify for different environments different configs instead of everything the same everywhere. So for example, there are things that you want in production that you don't want locally, like caching, the devil module, the payment gateway to use the test API information, and you don't actually push that up, or a banner telling the client that this is the staging site and not to get sad when their content things disappear. That is, I think, the most important, because that's all the time. I edit it. How come it's not live? Because you bookmarked the staging site before we launched, and you're editing content there. That's why it is not on the site when people go there. But so you could place a block or something, or a banner that says, this is the staging site. Go here for all your content edits. And you don't accidentally ever push that live. So it is weird and very hard to set up. So we're just going to go ahead and do it live and see what happens. So right here, I have just a stock Drupal 8 site, and I've installed config split, and that is pretty much it. And then I'll sad screen. There is a banner across that is cut off on this that it says, "This is the local site. Don't expect changes made here to show up on the live site." Let me, I know, I'll just open inspect and leave that like this. So therefore you can see that. And then in here I have like, welcome to local. So what we're going to do is when we're switching different environments, for this, that's going to be the only changes that are going to be different. We're going to have the site name different, and I'm going to change that block. You could do more things, like the devil module or other stuff, but since this is a base thing, it's probably the easiest to show, and I don't see why you would have your content types differently between environments. You could, but I don't know why you do that. So you install config split, and then you will, under the configuration, you already have the configuration synchronization, but then you'll get this new thing, config split settings. And we're defining 3 different split settings: a local, prod, and staging. So first, we'll look at our local, and the main thing you have to set up here is just do projector. Okay, let me. Yes, I'm going to do that, and then make that screen way smaller. Perfect. All right. So you will set the folder that you want to put your configuration just for the local environment. And you'll see this line right below there. It says the directory relative to the Drupal root to which the save filter config. Remember, we recommend a sibling directory from what you defined in your settings.php. So that is very important. So we will jump over to here. And if I go to sites, default, setting, get that bigger, okay, settings.php, and we go down to the bottom. Ooh, I am on, not the site I thought it was. Config split, docker, sites, default. Oh, CD. Okay. All right, so you'll see, you can see that great. Yes. So right there, config directory sync, I'm going outside of the doc root to a config directory, then one called default, and then default. So that is where we are putting the normal Drupal config. If you weren't using config split, that is where all your config would be. And so then what we're doing for config split is we are just changing this last directory. So things will be config default local, config default prod, config default stage. And then we can show that, like config default, and you can see that? Yeah, so then you'll see we have the default, a local, a prod, a stage, and then a production, because that's there from previously. When I typoed it. And then the one thing I do is you do have this weight, which is like normal Drupal weights. You can choose any number, and the higher the number, the later in the config process it imports. Anytime I've used it, besides like 0 and 1, we don't really use it. But we set the normal default to 0, and then local is an override of that, so it runs afterwards. If you got super specific, then you could have something that ran after the local and after that. I don't know why, but you can. And then the main thing that we have to do here is you have to actually tell the config split which things you want to split out. And these multi-select lists are absolutely terrible. They should change them. So what I always have to end up doing is inspecting it and making them larger, because you can't see anything. So you go like width, 100%, height, like 700 pixels. Let me make that smaller. So then you can actually see what you're selecting. So in here, anything you select here, you're saying, I want this different on this environment than the default config. So I did system.site. Because that is this things like the site name, where your 404 page is, the email, all those things, because I'm changing the site name to include local, state, and staging to override the default site name, so you know you're on a different environment. And then also up here, I have a block called not live site that will display when it's not the live site, which shows up on the local environment. But in here, you would have things like your devil settings, cache settings, anything like that. And so if you want individual settings, you use this select. You can also do here and say entire modules. Like for example, devil, you don't care what setting it is for devil. Any devil setting you want overridden in local because you want to turn it on. And same with like advag, like we want to ignore those, but you can do individual things too. So for local, we choose just those two we care about, and we save it. And then the prod and stage are exactly the same setup. I called it prod. I changed the directory name to be prod, so it's config default prod. And then the same deal, the system site and stage is the same.
Can that be exported? I mean, is there a way to do that without the UI, so you don't have to make the gigantic thing? Can you support the YAML file?
Yes, this does generate a YAML file, so you could just go create it and hit save, and then go open the YAML file, and it's just an array of names, and you can just go add more.
Gotcha.
Yep, that probably is the best way, and that's definitely what I do if I'm like, I just want to add one more, and I already know the config name. Yeah. And the config name is system.site, which is system.site.config.yaml. So you just remove that, and that system.site is the config you're ignoring. So we have that, and then what I'm doing to switch those is if we go back to the settings.php, because we want to dynamically, based on our environment, change which config we're importing. So what I did here is locally, I just created an environment variable called environment. If you're using something like Acquia, they have like a sample settings.php of like, this is how you tell which environment you're on. Anything like that, any way that you can trigger, you could do it by like your base URL, whatever. So I just did environment because it's simple for this thing. And if it's local, we say config split local, status is true. The prod is false, the stage is false. If it's stage, only the stage is true. If it's prod, only the prod is true. And that's why when you go to here, you'll see this one is active, and these ones are inactive because they're overridden by the settings.php. So they will not import. And then just like normal config, so in here, environment is currently set to local, and so then just like normal config, when you sites config split docker, when you go fin drush, I'm using doxel, so that's what the fin's for. So drush config import, it's going to run, and it should say there are no changes to import. Great, because we are all up to date, and you could go make a change and export it, but that's just normal config things, so we don't really need to go over that. But what we'll do is we'll change this environment to be stage. I really liked what you did on how you just had a different site spun up called prod. I was like, oh, that would have been better. Just edit the environment variable, go up, and then gotta go fin up, restart the container to get the new environment variable, clear the cache, because I changed the settings.php, and then if we run the import, it's going to say, hey, a couple things changed, because now we've just deployed it to staging, and then we'll import those, we'll go back to the site, and we will see that the changes have been made. And so we use Drush. You can also use Drupal console. The one issue we have with Drupal console running config is it doesn't ask you. In Drush, it'll be like, hey, these 5 things changed. Are you sure you want to import it? And Drupal, just like Drupal console, it's like, hey, we imported this config. And you're like, oh, I didn't think it was going to import all that. Or you export it, and it's like, it's like, great, we deleted all your config. Like, oh, oops. So here, it'll be like, hey, the stage site, now there's a block called stage site. We're going to create that because it didn't exist. System site has changed, and the not live site is deleted because that block no longer is used on the staging site. So yes, we want to import those things. And then we switch back to here. And if we just go back to the home page, you'll say, and I need to get that. So now see it says stage up there, config split sample, and then you can't see because it's yellow, but it says this is the stage site, don't expect changes here. So that is now, we've deployed those configs to staging because based on the environment variable, it knows we want to import the staging config. So we can quickly just go, same thing, change it to prod. So re-up the container, clear the cache, run the import, which is why what you did was way better. And then it will go back to, it will go to the prod, so it's going to remove that banner off, and then the site name is going to change again, this time to say prod. And then, if there are questions, we could do that, and then I'll show you the steps you can do to make this work with a multi-site. But spoiler, you shouldn't do it. It's terrible. But it does sort of work. And it's fairly similar. So this one, once again, system.site has updated, and we are no longer having that staging block, so it's getting deleted. And we go back, refresh this page. Welcome to prod, and there's not that banner, so then this is your production site. So we have different config on all the different environments. And then the normal config things, if I create a content type local, I export it. Since it's not flagged by config split, it's going to deploy across all of the environments, which is what you would expect. So you can still go and push up normal changes across all your environments. But then anytime you add a new module or a new thing that you want differently, because like you might add a new module for Google Analytics or something, but you want to say, well, on staging we want to use a different Google Analytics key or just not at all, then in your staging you would have to, or in your prod, either one, you'd have to either just only turn it on in prod or have it on always, but in your different, only only your production one has like the right API key, or whatever you have to do to keep them separate. So are there any questions on that part so far? Yeah.
So the configuration that you defined split, that's on a per YAML file basis? Or can that be down to like the key base inside the YAML file?
I've only done it per YAML file. You might be able to do it per key. I know you can do wildcards. It says one configuration key per line, so I would think that means you could do an individual key in a YAML file.
So you can narrow it down to just site name instead of system site.
Yeah.
And then you can pull up and stuff you can do without splitting anything.
Yep, and you can do wildcards, so you could just do like block.star, all blocks for whatever reason.
Yeah.
We're keeping separate. Yeah. That would be cool, because when you do it this way, since 404s and things point to node IDs, if you don't have those, you're going to break it when you try to push it somewhere. Because I've had that before. It's like, well, I can't import it because then that page doesn't exist. Anything else on that? Now I can get on and show the multi-site way. Okay, cool. So on the multi-site, it is mostly the same. And you just go to... Okay, so I have another one. I took that site and cloned it because a couple things need to change, and I didn't want to confuse it, but I took that first site, and then I added a sites.php to define the multi-sites, and then we do one extra step is what we've done in the config split settings, is I've now defined, you'll see, instead of just being like, I should zoom that in, it's so small. Okay, instead of just being like local prod stage, I prefixed it with like, this is site 2's local, site 2's prod, site 2's stage, and then site 2's default. That's a new one we add because we're sharing the one default directory between every site, between all the multi-sites, which is probably like your main content types and everything like that. But then this individual site will probably have default stuff that's specific to them, that is across all environments, and then they'll have things that are specific to them that are per environment. So how we got into this was we had a client that already built the entire website, and they're like, it's for this one organization, and they have like a sister organization that does the exact same thing. They have a different theme, a different logo, and different content. That is it. And the theme is basically the same thing and a different shade of blue. So it's the same exact site, but we don't want to use the same Git repo and just have different databases because there will be differences. We don't want to fork the repo and then have to like manually sync config because we're still actively building these sites. So we think a multi-site is the best solution, and theirs is on Acquia, and Acquia supports multi-site. But then they still with a multi-site, didn't want to have to. I created a content site on site A. I'm going to export the config. I'm going to copy that and then paste that config over into site B and fix any kind of conflicts that happen and push it up and then import it. They're like, it'd be great if it just was normal config split. So we had to do that, and if I go here, this follows the thing of now we're not just doing config, it's so tiny. So we're not just doing config /default, we're using config / the multi-site name /default, config multi-site name /stage /prod, and then in our config split multi-site config. So in there, is that pretty? In the config directory on there, we still have a default directory, then a main site, and then a site 2. And if you go into the default directory, that is just like normal config. So config default is everything shared, and then main site, you'll go in and it's got default local prod. Main site local has like just the one or two things that are different about it. And so what we had to do for that was root sites default settings.php. So really the only difference here is now our config directory, instead of being /config default, we just did config default. And so that's where that puts it in, and then config splits everything else out. And one of the things we struggled with here was actually understanding how config filter and config split actually work. And once we realized how it functions, we were able to kind of wrap our heads around how to do this. So, because config split doesn't do anything super magical, it just hooks into the normal config import and export, and then based on whatever splits you set up, essentially is just creating a new directory with all the config that it needs to import, and then saying, hey Drupal, there's the 1,000 files that it needs to import. Drupal doesn't necessarily know that it's grabbing some config from this folder and some from this folder. It just says, give me all the config to import, and config split comes in there and says, oh wait, not this one, grab this one instead. Because for some reason that helped us once we figured that out, because we were just like, we couldn't figure it out because we would clone it down from one site and then we're like, great, let's import to the other site, and it's like everything changed. Or you would do it and then it was putting configs in the wrong spots. And once we figured out, like, because we were trying to go like /config default, because that's just how it already was set up, and doing it with the multisite, that broke everything. So once we're like, it's just config default, that made it better, because then everything was still sibling directories. But then, so besides that, in here it's still the same. We kept the same keys for the configs. And then one thing that is important for this is the site UUIDs have to match, because you're not supposed to do this. So luckily for us, when they started, the other site didn't exist. Our job was to make it for them. So I just cloned the database, and it was the exact same site. And then I just like went in and edited the site name and swapped the logo, and it's the same site. Or you can, with Drush, get the site UUID with a variable get, and then variable set it to the other one so they match. And we ended up having to do that in Acquia, because each environment in Acquia had a different site UUID, and I had to make a match all the way across so we could import them. So once you have it this set up, then your drush command changes a little bit. So it's drush, and you have to pass in the URI equals default is what it's going to do anyways. But I have default, and then I have site2. So I'm going to do config import. And this is where I said you shouldn't do it with multisite, because it doesn't work in the sample. In a minute, I can show it to you on the actual site we did it on. Totally works, and it's set up exactly the same. So this is the issue that we got stuck on right here. The site UUIDs do not match, and if you do a fin drush URI very good site dot. Is that it? It's something. Yes. Oh. Come on. It's somewhere. It's in my history. I ran this. Okay. Okay. So that, and then if you go, that was default, and then if I go site2, which is my other site, those UUIDs definitely are the same, but Drupal thinks they don't match for some reason. So this is the issue that was a very large struggle with getting this, and I honestly don't remember how we got around it, because they didn't match at one point, and we made the match, and it worked. A lot of trial and error would make it work, and I can show it to you on an actual working site in a minute. But are there questions first on that? Cool. So when you paused, is there a pause button, or did you just hit the stop? When you just gotta hit stop.
Yeah.
Cool.